Welcome to Fridays at 3. I'm Leslie Herman, co-chair with Ruth Mackaman of the Fridays at 3 program. As most of you know, this program is a public program of the LP Squared, the Lifelong Peer Learning Program of the CUNY Graduate Center. 3 times each semester, we offer talks on a wide range of topics open to the public. So by all means, invite your family and friends. Our talk today is on the new space race. To introduce our speaker, I call upon my colleague, Ken Whitty.
Hi, everyone. Space again is in the news, and Christian Davenport covers all the latest space events for the Washington Post. He's been covering major stories at the Post since the year 2000. He's the author of The Space Barons, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and the Quest to Colonize the Cosmos. It was published in 2018. He was a producer and co-host of Space Launch Live, the Discovery Channel's Emmy Award-winning broadcast of SpaceX's first crewed mission last year. It's my pleasure to introduce Christian Davenport. Christian, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks, Ken, and thanks to everyone at CUNY for having me. This is a real treat for me as someone who grew up in New York City. I'm originally from Brooklyn, but have been at the Washington Post, as Ken said, for 21 years. And it's kind of funny. I sort of stumbled my way into the space beat. I didn't grow up enamored by space the way a lot of my colleagues were on the space beat. I was born in 1973, so the Apollo moon landings had ended in 1972, so I missed out on that. I don't have that memory that so many people have of watching the black and white TV and seeing Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walk on the surface of the moon. In fact, my first memory of space was nothing quite so romantic. I was at home in Brooklyn, sick from school, watching, I think, probably some mindless game show. And in January of 1986, and the news broke in that the space shuttle Challenger had exploded, killing all 7 astronauts on board, including the teacher, Krista McCullough from New Hampshire. And I sat there all day long watching that footage going over again and again and again in my mind, and just wasn't enamored by it. And even when the shuttle came back online, it went, as Neil deGrasse Tyson said, the space shuttle went boldly where we had gone so many times before. Space shuttle and then the International Space Station represented a new era for NASA of human exploration, and a significant one, but it wasn't quite as inspiring for me, frankly, and I didn't grow up paying attention to it. The International Space Station is about 240 miles up in orbit around the Earth. I mean, that distance when it's overhead is about the distance between New York City and Washington, D.C., whereas the moon is about 240,000 miles. So there's a big significance there. And frankly, I had been embedded in Iraq a couple of times during the war, and was writing more about the military, and got this assignment from an editor at the Washington Post here to say, can you go cover this press conference? It was in 2014. There was some guy named Elon Musk who was suing the Air Force over a launch contract to launch Pentagon satellites. And I didn't have a real sense of who Elon Musk was or you know what he was all about. I don't think I knew too much about his company, SpaceX, that he had founded. And I thought it was very odd that he would go off and sue the government agency that he was trying to get a contract from. But I sat there and listened to him talk about his plans for space exploration. And this, you know, for me anyway, opened up my eyes to, you know, what I saw was a significant, at first, a significant news story. They tell you, and this goes back to Watergate, follow the money. Well, if Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson, and at the time, Paul Allen, the late Paul Allen, who died a couple of years ago, but founded Microsoft with Bill Gates, if they were all putting significant portions of their own personal finances into their space companies, then maybe that's something we should be paying attention to. The more I sort of looked into what was going on here, the more I realized that this is a story that transcends my day job as a reporter at the Washington Post, that what we're witnessing here is, and I believe then and believe now, is the sort of dawn of a new era in space exploration. There are certain chapters along the way that have been written about human exploration in space. And it goes back to Mercury and Gemini and Apollo, right, in the 60s, in that post, in the Cold War space race with the Soviet Union. And then we had Space Shuttle and the International Space Station. And now we have this commercial space race where companies and private enterprises are competing against each other and reprising the role that nations had, the United States versus the Soviet Union. Now it's Elon Musk and SpaceX versus Jeff Bezos and his company, Blue Origin. And what they're also doing is driving new technology and ending government's long-held monopoly on space. I mean, for decades, space was too difficult, too expensive. The barriers to entry were too high to even think about having a corporation go in and do this and make money at it. It was just inconceivable. And in fact, when Elon started SpaceX, he gave himself, maybe a 10 to 15% chance that the company would ever succeed, but thought that it would be important to do that, and actually decided to do it after, thinking about space and the future of humanity, and going on NASA's website at one point and thinking, well, we've been to the moon, where are we in going to Mars? And realized that there wasn't really a concrete plan to go to Mars. And in fact, every effort, to go back to deep space, to get out of Earth orbit, to go beyond the International Space Station, to get to the moon and beyond, had really gone nowhere since the Apollo era. And, decades were going by, and he decides that this is something he's going to try to do himself. And so I decided, this was too big of a story, and I'm going to write a book about it that is called The Space Barons. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then, talk a little bit also about what's happened in the 2 or 3 years since my book came out. And also, while I'm talking, I do want to remind people to please ask questions. There's a Q&A function. We're going to reserve some time at the end of this for questions, and I really welcome your questions. And to me, I find that's the most rewarding part of these talks. So I'm hopeful that we'll get a lot of those in there, and we can dedicate a lot of time instead of me just sort of going on and on. But I'll start with, when we talk about the Space Barons, and I'll focus on Elon and Jeff the most, and talk a little bit about Richard Branson. They all have these big aspirational visions for space. And there's a lot of similarities in what they want to accomplish, but very different means and how to get there. Elon's plan, and again, these are guys with big visions and big egos, and with massive track records of performance, and so they don't think small. I mean, Elon wants to build a city on Mars, and he wants to get humanity there. We've been to the moon, and he wants to go to Mars, and he wants to do it for the exploration, and he wants to do it just to say we did it, because it's there, like climbing that mountain. But he also thinks it's important because, humanity is just anchored to, this rock we call Earth. And if something should happen to the Earth, if an asteroid were going to hit it and humanity goes the way of the dinosaur, then there's no backup. There's no plan B. Humanity could go extinct. Obviously, this is not something that's going to happen, tomorrow or in our lifetimes, but it could be thousands of years away or millions of years away. But he wants to start building toward that future. I mean, if you have your computer and all your sensitive files and photographs and music if your computer crashes, you would want to back that up. And he kind of wants to do that for the human race, and sees Mars as the closest planet, our neighbor. It has 1/6 Earth gravity. Yeah, you can't breathe the air, and the temperature can get really, really cold, but it's a lot better than, say, Venus. And thinks that we could actually survive as a species there. Jeff Bezos has a different point of view, and it's interesting that Jeff is now just sort of starting to come out and talk more publicly, because for years nobody knew that Jeff Bezos had a space company. And in fact, Jeff Bezos founded his space company, Blue Origin, in 2000, which is 2 years before Elon founded SpaceX. And the name of the company, Blue Origin, sort of tells you a little bit about his ambitions, right? That blue is the pale blue dot, Earth, and origin. This is where humanity began. So he also has this vision of humanity moving out into space. But Jeff doesn't really want to settle down on Mars. As he says, Mars is, if you want to know what Mars is like, go to the top of Mount Everest and try to live there. Or he also says that Mars makes Antarctica look like a garden paradise. I mean, it's not a place where humans want to live. And his goal is to build these massive colonies in space. I mean, not just the International Space Station, which can hold, normally 6 astronauts at a time, but massive colonies that hold thousands of people, that have cities, and that are in orbit around the Earth, so that if you wanted to, you could come back down to Earth. Now, it sounds a little crazy and a little science fiction-y, and this, again, is not something he is interested in doing in his lifetime, because it's not going to happen. It's a multi-generational vision. He's thinking 300-400 years in the future, where you get to this point and humanity then proliferates. And his idea is not so much worried that Earth is going to get hit by an asteroid, but that the human race is already growing and expanding, and we're using up all of the resources here on Earth. If you compound energy use by just 2 or 3% a year, in just a couple hundred years, we sort of run out of the resources on Earth that we need to sustain the kind of lifestyle that we have here, where we can have an interactive chat over Zoom and order our packages on Amazon. That there's only going to be an increased consumption for energy, and Earth's energy is finite. In space, there's the possibility, if you mine asteroids and you do manufacturing in space, and that you preserve Earth as sort of a national park. And in fact, this is a vision that Jeff Bezos has had a long, long time. I mean, Blue Origin is the fulfillment of his childhood dream. He did not grow up wanting to sell books on the internet. He did grow up fantasizing about space and dreaming about space. And he was a disciple of a futurist and a physicist who was a Princeton University professor named Gerard O'Neill, who wrote a book called The High Frontier that laid out a lot of the vision that Jeff Bezos subscribes to. And when Jeff graduated from high school and he was the class valedictorian, he gave a speech and he said that we need to go to space to preserve the Earth. And in that speech, he said Earth should be, preserved as a national park. Today, he still gives a version of that speech, only he says that Earth should be preserved and should be zoned residential and maybe light industrial, and all heavy industry goes off into space. So this is something he has been thinking about for a long, long time, and has said that he would invest $1 billion of his own money into Blue Origin to sort of help build that capability, which is very difficult to do. And he talks about how, for example, when he started Amazon, the infrastructure was in place. The phone companies had laid down the cables, that carried the cables for the internet. So that was in place. There was this invention called the credit card, where he could take people's money, and there was the post office to deliver the books and the goods he was selling on Amazon to people. In space, that infrastructure isn't really there yet. I mean, you can't go and be a kid in your dorm room and start a space company, because again, the barriers to entry are too high. There are no Mark Zuckerbergs yet of space. And so what he wants to do is to start building that infrastructure, and starting by going to space, lowering down the cost of accessing space, getting people there more frequently, more reliably, more safely, making it more routine, which is something that Elon Musk wants to do. And it's something that Richard Branson wants to do too. And Richard Branson has a company called Virgin Galactic. It's a space tourism company. It doesn't have the big ambitions that a SpaceX or a Blue Origin has of moving humanity off the face of the Earth into the cosmos for good, but instead taking people, for now very wealthy people, on suborbital tourism trips. Suborbital means you're not going into orbit, you're going straight up, scratching the edge of space, being weightless for a few minutes. You may have seen the flights that Richard went on himself. Jeff and Blue Origin have their own suborbital space tourism program. And Jeff went, and William Shatner, who played Captain Kirk in Star Wars, also just did it. And open up space to more people, because today there have only been about 600 people who have ever been to space since Yuri Gagarin became the first person to do it. So it's a tiny fraction of people, and their thought, if more people can do it, more people can sort of enjoy the benefits of space. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So those are sort of their big visions. The key, though, is new technologies. Right now, if you want to launch a rocket to space, I mean, depending on how big the rocket is and where you want to go in orbit, traditionally, we've seen rocket launches cost anywhere from $100 million to $400 million or more. The big rocket that NASA is building, the Space Launch System, years behind schedule, billions of dollars over budget. I mean, this is $20 billion. I mean, that kind of a price tag is not going to lead to more people accessing space and us going reliably. They want to build a routine cadence. As Jeff Bezos said, you want to get really good at it, you want to practice. You wouldn't go to a surgeon who did a surgery 8 to 10 times a year, but yet in a good year, that's about the number of rocket launches you would have, because it's so expensive. We don't send a lot of rockets into space. You want practice. So the key is to have a reusable rocket. I mean, the way rockets traditionally work is there's a first stage of the rocket. That's the most powerful part. It takes off. That second stage, then if it's a two-stage rocket, will separate and ultimately deploy the crew capsule or the satellite into its orbit. And that first stage, which is really where a lot of the cost of the rocket is, would fall into the ocean and be discarded, never to be used again. In fact, there are rockets today literally all over the Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of Florida, off Cape Canaveral, because they've been discarded. And that's the way we went around for years. Well, just imagine if after you took an airline flight and you flew from New York to Los Angeles and they threw away the airplane after every single flight. That would just make commercial aviation prohibitively expensive. There's no way you could do it. And yet that's what we've been doing in space. So Jeff and Elon both decided that they wanted to build reusable rockets. And this is something that NASA had looked into doing. I mean, this is an idea that had been around for a long time, but to get out of Earth's gravity well and through Earth's atmosphere takes an enormous amount of energy, and you have to be traveling so fast to get into orbit. I mean, the International Space Station, for example, in orbit travels at 17,500 miles an hour. It circles the globe every 90 minutes. So to get something going to that speed and then to bring it back into Earth's atmosphere and to land is a very, very difficult thing. And SpaceX actually tried and failed for a long time before being able to do it and do it successfully. And the first time they did it, they landed on a landing pad at Cape Canaveral, and they've also got a ship that goes out a few hundred miles off Cape Canaveral that the rocket lands on. And so we've got a video of Ariana can cue that up to sort of show how difficult it was for SpaceX at the beginning. They actually SpaceX put out a video that was sort of a tongue in cheek about how hard it was. So if we can go ahead and play that first video. So that's a lot of fun. I remember that first landing when SpaceX landed the first rocket in 2015. I was down at the Cape for that, and it came through the sky. And right as it was touching down, right before then, there was a sonic boom. And I'd never heard a sonic boom before, and I actually thought it blew up, but it didn't. So when Jeff Bezos started Blue Origin, it started out as a think tank, and it was just a small group of people huddled in a warehouse in an industrial part of Seattle, and they were thinking about, how do we make space more accessible, more reliable? And they looked at all different kinds of ideas and technologies. Like one of them, for example, he told me about for my book when I interviewed him was they looked at building a giant bullwhip, not to fly people, but to maybe shoot cargo or satellites. And the idea is that with a bullwhip, you can actually break the sound barrier. I mean, just with your arm, because it's I'm not a physicist, but as he explained to me, it's conservation of momentum, it's mass times velocity. As the mass of the whip decreases toward the point, the velocity increases, so that as it unfurls, it goes really fast. And so they had this idea that maybe they would bullwhip people, which of course they didn't do that. They ultimately decided that no, they needed to sort of use a traditional rocket, but land it. And they actually, Jeff did it first, a month before Elon. It's sort of amazing that they did it so closely together. Now, as Elon would be quick to point out, the rocket that Jeff used, and we'll see this video in a minute, is a New Shepard rocket, named for Alan Shepard, the first American in space, who did not go to orbit. And the New Shepard rocket doesn't go to orbit. It goes up just like that Virgin Galactic space plane. It goes about 65 miles or so gets outside the majority of Earth's atmosphere, the sky will go black. You'll have weightlessness. You can see the curvature of the Earth, but then it comes straight back down. So that was sort of a big deal. And they've got a capsule on the top, which I think you'll see the beginning of the capsule, will land softly in the desert. But you'll also see that rocket, the booster itself, coming back down. Ariana, if you can play that one.
Main parachute deploy. Touchdown.
PM's at 20,000 feet. Drag brake deploy. Estimate 10 seconds until engine restart. 12,000 feet. 5,000 feet. Engine starting. We have thrust. 1,000 feet. LGS deploy. 50 feet. 7 feet per second. Touchdown. Engine stop. Welcome back, New Shepard.
Perfect landing. We made history today.
So there you can see that these boosters, they're autonomous, right? They use a GPS to know where they are coming down so they can hit their landing site. The interesting thing about that landing that we just saw, you see at the last minute, right before it's about to touch down, it kind of scooches over. So it's dead center on the landing pad. And they actually since then went in and tweaked the algorithm because they don't want perfection to be the enemy of the good. That, that it's fine if you're on the edge of the circle, the edge of the landing pad. You don't want to have any kind of problems at the last second as it tries to lurch over, because you saw it almost go sideways to do that. So they've continued to perfect that. And the booster itself, particularly the Falcon 9, that's SpaceX's sort of workhorse rocket that goes to orbit, is constantly making adjustments. It's got these thrusters on the side of the rocket that will reorient it, point it in the right direction. It does usually two burns, what's called a re-entry burn, where it re-enters the atmosphere and it refires the engine. I mean, obviously the engines ignite to blast the rocket off from the launch pad, but then they save enough fuel so that the engine can light again to come back through and then light a second time for the landing. And that's a very difficult thing to do. And just a quick side note on how they did that. They want a lot of performance in the rocket. And so they take, liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen, or I'm sorry, refined natural gas, but the liquid oxygen, they super cool it. And they make it really, really cold, because the colder it is, the denser it is. The denser it is, the more you can pack into the rocket, the more performance you get. So you can save, you have extra margin for these landing burns. But there's one more, if we could cue up the last one, that shows you the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket sped up, coming back from space and landing on the ship, and what that looks like in sped up time. Yeah, so that to me never gets old. I've been watching it do that for 5 years. I love seeing those. you can see the legs deploy at the last minute. There are those, they're called grid fins, those kind of fans on the side. Now they're made out of titanium that can twist a little bit. It's sort of like putting your hand out the window of a moving car, and you can sort of adjust it. That's how the rocket remains stable, and those help steer as well. So yeah, I mean, the other thing, to understand about, as I call them, the space barons, which is obviously the title of my book, is that, they're not NASA. They are businessmen, and they all got their start in other industries and attacking those industries and disrupting them. Jeff doing that with the book industry, and then retail in general with Amazon. Elon doing it with PayPal, and then with Tesla, and virtually taking on all of Detroit, and Richard Branson entering different markets, with Virgin Atlantic and all of his enterprises. And they see each other and they compete against each other. And even on the landings, when Jeff, landed that rocket for the first time, and he tweeted something to the effect of the rarest of beasts. Elon had, responded angrily and said, actually that SpaceX had, flown prototype rockets, hundreds or thousands of yards up high and brought them back, in testing, and then made sort of a big point that, this was a suborbital rocket. Landing that is, sort of an order of magnitude easier than landing an orbital rocket, like coming back from delivering a payload into orbit. And they've really continued to compete there. And they continue to compete today, depending on how much you're watching the news. So the book came out in 2018, and it's sort of amazing how much has gone on since then. So I thought I'd just take another little bit here to talk about everything that's going on right now, because I've got to say, I've got the best job at the Washington Post. Being a space reporter right now is so much fun. There's so much going on. It's a little bit crazy, but it's a fascinating time. And I think, that really sort of shows you how we're in this new era of space exploration. And again, please keep all of the questions coming into the Q&A, because after I do this overview, I want to jump right into your questions. So we haven't talked a lot about NASA. I've been focused on the space barons and the billionaires, but we shouldn't discount NASA at all, because NASA had the foresight to fund companies like SpaceX. And if it wasn't SpaceX, if it wasn't NASA, there would be no SpaceX. In fact, Elon, at one point after winning an early contract, changed his login password to "I love NASA." NASA just landed another rover on Mars, a Perseverance rover, which is the size of an SUV. They just flew the Ingenuity helicopter on Mars. They touched an asteroid and did a sample retrieval in the OSIRIS-REx mission of an asteroid 200 million miles away, and they're bringing that back. So, they're still doing big, amazing things, and they have got what's called the Artemis program, which is Artemis in the mythology of the Greek as a twin sister of Apollo. And this is NASA's plan to return to the moon. Initially, NASA was thinking in the 2026, 2028, actually really 2028 timeframe. But the Trump administration came in and said, no, we want that to happen on a much more expedited schedule, and directed NASA to try to do it by 2024, which is to, I think, give the space agency a sense of urgency and to light a fire under them. But of course, also, if Trump had won re-election, then that would have happened perhaps during his term, and he could have taken credit for it. So I think there was a political calculation to that as well. But the interesting thing about it is the Biden administration has come in here in Washington and laid waste to so much of Trump's policies. But one of the programs they have kept is the Artemis moon program. And that's significant because one of the reasons why NASA hasn't been successful in returning to the moon or getting to Mars is not NASA's fault. It's because they have to, they have whims of different White Houses and different administrations and different directions from Congress, which of course hold the purse strings. And so, George W. Bush will come in and say, we're going back to the moon, and Obama will come in and say, no, we've been there, done that. We want to go to Mars. And then Trump goes in and says, we're going to the moon. So I think it's significant that we have this continuity of keeping Artemis going to the moon. I was actually just on a press call before this talk where NASA has its Space Launch System rocket, which is a massive rocket, biggest, most powerful rocket since the Saturn V moon rocket during Apollo. And they have it fully stacked and assembled at the Kennedy Space Center with the Orion crew capsule on top. They're looking to maybe try to launch that for the first time in February. And this would be the Artemis 1 mission. And that would put the Orion capsule without any astronauts on board. They want to test it without crew first to make sure it's safe before they put human beings on board. And it would go in orbit around the moon for several weeks and then come back. The Artemis 2 mission, scheduled for, depending on how things go, 2023, 2024, would have a crew in the capsule and again go in orbit around the moon. And then the Artemis 3 mission, the NASA's still, I think, notionally talking about landing on the moon in 24. I don't think anyone thinks that's possible, probably closer to 26, 27, 28, somewhere in there, if everything goes according to plan. And even that is a big if. But landing astronauts on the moon on that third mission, which obviously would be a big deal. And what's interesting about that, when you talk about the competition between the space barons, is they are competing now. And NASA wanted to do a public-private partnership and contract out to see if the private industry could come up and develop the spacecraft that would land the astronauts on the surface of the moon. So this is a spacecraft that would meet up with the Orion crew capsule in lunar orbit. The crew would transfer from Orion into the lunar lander, which would then take them down to the surface of the moon. And when they were done, take them back out to the Orion crew capsule, which would then bring them home. Everyone thought Blue Origin was going to win that contract. Blue Origin put together what it called the national team with Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and Draper. And it was this mix of sort of new aerospace and older aerospace trying to go together. And Elon and SpaceX came in and won the contract ultimately, even though Blue Origin had won the most money in an early initial phase. And now Blue Origin is sued over that contract, saying that NASA's procurement was flawed. And this is creating quite a bit of tension and antagonism right now between Blue Origin and SpaceX in general, and then specifically between Elon and Jeff, who are sort of going at it in Twitter, just like they did over the landings of their rockets. So that's one thing that's going on. The other significant milestone is what's called the Commercial Crew Program, again, a NASA program, but also using this public-private partnership that I think defines this new age of space, where the space shuttle retired in 2011. And all of a sudden, the United States government and NASA had no way to fly astronauts to space. In fact, most people don't even realize this, we relied on Russia for nearly a decade to fly our astronauts to the International Space Station. And without any capability, actually the price tag went up. It went up from about $25 million a seat to close to $85 million a seat, just looking at supply and demand. And the Russians were charging us more and more, knowing that we had to pay it because we wanted to keep our American presence on the International Space Station, which after all, we have invested about $100 billion into that orbiting laboratory. NASA's plan was, again, to go out to industry, the commercial sector, and say, who can develop a spacecraft for us to take us to take our astronauts to the International Space Station. This was a follow-on contract. Initially, they said we need private industry to act like a sort of a taxi service to take cargo and supplies to the International Space Station. At the time, the thinking was that no, private industry shouldn't be trusted with the lives of astronauts. Human spaceflight is just too difficult. But the Obama administration came in, saw the success that the commercial sector was having, particularly SpaceX, and awarded SpaceX and Boeing in 2014 the contracts to fly astronauts to the International Space Station. Now, at the time of the contract award in 2014, everybody thought that Boeing was going to go first, that they were going to sort of win this race. They're the legacy, behemoth, the contractor. SpaceX even then was a new kid on the block. SpaceX won, and they flew the very first mission with crew in a vehicle configuration that in many ways is much safer than the space shuttle. The space shuttle, if you remember, was tethered to the side of the rocket and the booster and ultimately deployed, but there was no way for it to escape. So what I have on my screensaver behind me is a test of an in-flight abort where the crew capsule aborts from the booster. So if anything goes wrong with the booster, if it explodes, there are sensors on board the capsule that will jettison it away from the booster. And that's what you see behind me. So SpaceX flew that first human spaceflight mission in May of last year. It's gearing up toward the end of this month to fly its fourth total mission, but its first one was a test flight, and then they're flying now international missions. And that is a big deal because that flight last year was the first flight of NASA astronauts from United States soil since the space shuttle retired in 2011. So you had nearly a 10-year gap, which is a really big deal. We're seeing a lot of human spaceflight now, not just on SpaceX going to the International Space Station, but with this suborbital space tourism. And those generated a lot of publicity, a lot of hype, a lot of news, because Richard Branson went and Jeff Bezos went and William Shatner went. And their Blue Origin auctioned off one of its seats, and it went to $28 million. That's what someone was going to pay to be able to go on a flight that lasts all of 10 minutes from takeoff to landing. And you really only get about 3 or 4 minutes in space. Virgin Galactic has said its ticket price is $450,000. Blue Origin hasn't said what its sort of public ticket cost is going to go through. It's still going through the people in the auction to see what they'll be paying. But I think those first few seats are going for a few $1 million each, and then they'll go out to the public. And a lot of people, deride these flights as saying, these are these billionaires, and Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders was talking about this, other members of Congress, talking about it, saying we have problems, here on Earth, and you're doing this for, rich people. And I think that it's a good thing, and it's a healthy thing to have that debate and talk about that, because it's true that at this point, they are not opening up access to space for everyday people. We are not there yet. Maybe at some point it'll become more routine. The cost will come down. Ordinary people will be able to go, but we're not there. But just for a moment, let's take the optimistic view and sort of follow, what their thinking is on this, and that if they are successful and they can fly more and more people to space, and they have that experience that today fewer than 600 people have had. And if you talk to astronauts, and I've talked to a lot of astronauts, and they talk about the profound experience of seeing the Earth from space and seeing the thin line of the atmosphere and realizing that's what protects Earth from the vastness of space and all the radiation coming down, and the curvature of the Earth, and just sort of the beauty and the majesty of Earth, and land masses without borders that are artificially drawn by humans, but just sort of one Earth. And if you remember, the picture taken, I think, by the Apollo 8 astronauts, the picture taken of Earth from the moon, the pale blue dot, that photograph, which is perhaps the most reproduced image in the history of photography, showing the Earth hanging there suspended in sort of the inky darkness of space, and making us realize that actually we are in space on Earth, that Earth is a spaceship that is in orbit around the sun. That had profound consequences, and in fact helped touch off the environmental movement and Earth Day. And so if you can imagine 10, 20, 30 years from now, where you go from 600 people have been to space to 6,000 to 60,000 people, and it gets to the point where someone, or someone who knows someone who's been to space and has had that experience, and has become changed by it, that perhaps could have a profound societal effect. I mean, astronauts will tell you all the time it's almost like a mantra in the astronaut corps that they wish, that Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin could go up in a spacecraft together and they would come back, singing Kumbaya. Well, I don't think that's the case, but I think it would help, sort of people realize that we're all on this Earth together, and that's sort of a big deal. The other point I just want to say about space tourism is this is not just Jeff Bezos or Richard Branson or Elon Musk's brainchild, and Elon is doing this too, not sending tourists on suborbital trips, but I don't know if you all paid attention to that Inspiration 4 mission that raised money for St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, that sort of a billionaire entrepreneur named Jared Isaacman, the founder of a company called Shift 4 Payments, he bought a trip on SpaceX and had 3 other people go with him, and they stayed. Ordinary civilians had never been to space before, not NASA government trained astronauts, and they stayed in orbit around for 3 days. And there's another company called Axiom that is booking flights for paying customers to the International Space Station, hugely expensive, $55 million each for the ride, and spending a week on the space station and coming back. But this notion of getting non-government people to space is not new. And in fact, it's something that NASA wanted to do from the very beginning. And so when they shifted from the Apollo era, and they're thinking about what's next, and Vietnam was raging at the time in the 70s, and the civil rights movement, and there just wasn't the appetite for a big government funded program to go back to the moon or to go on to Mars. The money just wasn't there. The appetite wasn't there. The polling actually showed that people just weren't as interested in the subsequent moon missions after Apollo 11. So they came up with the space shuttle, and as the name implies, shuttle was going to fly routinely. And they thought, it would fly 40, 50, maybe even 60 times a year, and that it would fly so frequently and so efficiently that NASA would need to fill seats with people who weren't, professionally trained. And they thought about, well, who should fly? And they actually had a task force put together on who this should be. And they decided first it would be a teacher. Then it would be a journalist, someone who could communicate this to the public. And then their third thought was, perhaps an artist, but they hadn't gotten there yet. And of course, the teacher was Krista McAuliffe, who flew in 1986 on Challenger. And when Challenger exploded, as I witnessed, when I was homesick that day in January of 1986, that put an end to what they called the Spaceflight Participant Program, even though NASA at that time had winnowed its group of journalists who were going to be in the second group down to the finalists. It was down to 40. And you had people like Walter Cronkite, for example, who was among the finalists to fly, but they ended up putting that away. And so now, all of these years later, you see the private enterprise, once again, standing on the shoulders of NASA and taking over and trying to do that again. I'll talk briefly about sort of the next thing that's going on right now, the next big thing in space. And again, it involves these public-private partnerships, is the International Space Station. It has been up there for more than 20 years. It has been continuously inhabited by human beings for more than 20 years. which is sort of incredible if you think about it, that there are right now 6 people in orbit flying above us. You can go on to a NASA website called Spot the Station and get an alert when the space station will be flying over you. I love going out and bringing my kids out there to see it. It's this bright dot. It looks like a star, but it's much brighter, and you can see how fast it's moving across the sky just with the naked eye. And I would encourage people to go check it out. But it's getting old. It's been up there for a long time. It sprung a leak last year. It has to maneuver. There's a lot of debris in space. It has to maneuver away from all of that debris. And NASA knows it can't stay up there forever. Congress is going to extend it to 2028 or 2030. But NASA is looking ahead and saying, if we're going to do the Artemis program, we're not going to be able to afford to invest in another big government space station. So they're looking once again to the private sector to be able to do this, to take over. And now you're beginning to see more companies wanting to go in and build a commercial space station. And they think there's perhaps a business case for that because, more governments, and you're seeing particularly a lot of governments in the Middle East, the UAE, for example, wanting to have more or having more ambitions in space, companies that want to do research in space. And so the hope is that by the time the International Space Station retires, there will be a commercial alternative or commercial alternatives, multiple space station in Earth orbit that are out there and that NASA would use. They would be a customer, but they would be one customer, many customers using these commercial habitats in space, which is a very big deal. And that will be, I think, a big thing, whether the commercial sector can pull that off at a time when China, for example, is putting together right now its own space station. Last week flew up another 3 astronauts to do that, to help assemble it. And so if China is the only game in town, then you could see them partnering with some of our allies on the International Space Station, and NASA in the United States being sort of left out. And there's a desire at NASA and now at the White House for that not to happen. The last thing I'll mention, and I do really want to get to questions, is to talk for a minute about SpaceX, because when you talk about the space barons and you talk about this growing commercial space industry, SpaceX is the leader by far. They are so far out ahead of everyone. They fly crew to the International Space Station. They fly supplies there. They won the contract for the lunar lander. They won contracts for the Pentagon. That initial press conference that I went to in 2014, they forced a settlement and now are able to compete for those launch contracts. They're putting up the Starlink internet constellation of satellites in space, which will beam the internet down to remote areas and potentially connect the 4 billion people without access to broadband. And Elon has built a private spaceport. So sort of think of a Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral and the southernmost tip of Texas, near a village called Boca Chica, that he's renaming Starbase. And it's to build his Starship prototype rocket with a super heavy booster, which he is moving rapidly. And this is the spacecraft that they bid to win the lunar lander contract. And this is the spacecraft and the rocket that he wants to use to get to Mars. It's in the colony to Mars that would fly dozens of people at a time. It would refuel in orbit. The booster itself has 37 engines that would fire at once. The spacecraft would have 6. It would be a massively capable vehicle. But the key is, again, it would be fully reusable and rapidly reusable. So not just the first stage, but this is really just a 2-stage rocket. It's the booster and then the spacecraft, which is the second stage, and they would both land. And the way he's figured this out, because he's always iterating, those earlier videos we show where the booster comes back vertically and land, here, what happens is the Starship spacecraft does kind of a belly flop where it goes from vertical to horizontal, and it's got these wings that keep it stable as it falls through the thick part of the atmosphere. And then right at the last second, it rights itself, fires its engines, and does the soft landing. And they tried this, just like that blooper video we saw where they kept blowing up. They kept blowing these up time after time, but then finally they were able to pull it off and land it. And that was sort of a big deal. And we've got, that's our final video. If Ariana can just play that, because you've got to see it for yourself. It's so cool.
3, 2, 1, ignition. We have liftoff.
So that's pretty cool. I think I'm going to leave it there for now and maybe open it up for questions. And if Marielle can maybe help moderate those, I'd welcome the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christian. And yes, my name is Marielle Villeray. I'm the Program Development Director for the Office of Academic Initiatives and Strategic Innovation here at the Graduate Center. And in that role, I'm the Director of LP Squared. I just quickly want to give a big thank you to CUNY TV. I'm here in the studios and their team is amazing in helping us bring the production for this program today. And yes, we have a few questions in the Q&A and I invite more. So as you listen through these questions, please enter them using the Q&A button at the bottom register of your screen. So Christian, Michael asks, do the so-called pioneers in space exploration actually participate in the scientific part of the program? And I would maybe add the engineering as well as the astronomy. What sort of collaboration is this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think right now, in terms of talking about the companies that we're focused on, the idea is to build the transportation infrastructure that will then allow the science to happen, and not just the science, but the business. And Jeff Bezos has talked about, wanting to see the kind of economic dynamism that we saw blossom at the advent of the internet happen in space. And the more, the easier you can get to space, the more science, you can have. But yes, they have scientists who are, at their companies. And what they do is a lot of these companies will launch NASA's scientific experiments to go to space. But right now, I think what the businesses are focused on is the launch, is the transportation, getting, we're going to launch the James Webb Telescope. That's actually going to be launched by Arianespace, the French space company, perhaps in December, which will be a huge deal. But if the prices come down, that's more science you can do in space.
Right. Well, on that note, Thomas Hardy asks about the financing of SpaceX. Maybe you could give a little bit more detail. We touched on that in the talk, but if you could dive in a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, so it started out from the beginning with Elon and $100 million of his own money that he got from PayPal, and he thought that was enough to build this rocket called the Falcon 1, which had a single rocket. It was a pretty small rocket, but he tried to get to orbit. They failed to get to orbit 3 times, and he was basically out of money, but had just enough for a 4th try and successfully got to orbit. And NASA came in and rescued him with a contract that led to them becoming a viable business. Ultimately helped them go from that Falcon 1 rocket to the Falcon 9, winning NASA contracts to fly cargo and supplies to the space station, and then that commercial crew program. They also have won a lot of contracts from the Pentagon, as I mentioned, and have built a real business, not just launching satellites and crew and cargo for NASA and the Pentagon, but also for the commercial sector. All of that, the commercial launch market had gone overseas until SpaceX came along, but they came in and disrupted that market as well. So there's a lot of government money, there's a lot of money on their own, and there's a lot of outside investment. They keep doing these investment rounds, and the valuation is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's some of this sort of fear of missing out. But there's a lot of people want to invest. There was one investor I remember talking to him, was early on, who's a fairly well-known investor in Silicon Valley, named Steve Jurvetson, and was early on at SpaceX and wanted to get into some of the later rounds. But SpaceX actually asked him, we want to open this up to other people. So SpaceX takes, a lot of revenue, and they're going to need that. What they're building toward now is not just, getting to the moon and Mars is expensive, but so is building a constellations, which we haven't talked too much about, of thousands of satellites in Earth orbit as part of their Starlink constellation that would beam the internet down to the people who don't have access to broadband. Big, ambitious projects, very expensive.
Indeed. And on that note, Howard Miller is picking up on the financing and is curious, is Musk still funding SpaceX, or is it funding itself with contractual revenues yet? Are there any contractual revenues?
Yeah, no, they've got a lot of contractual revenue. I mean, not just, again, from the commercial side, but from the government as well. I mean, they won the, off the top of my head, the commercial crew contract was, I think it was almost $3 billion. The lunar lander contract was $3 billion. Cargo resupply, the Pentagon launches, they'll sell those depending on what rocket they use and what orbit they go to, $100 million or more. A typical launch, I think, on a Falcon 9 rocket is, $60 to $100 million, somewhere in there. So yeah, I mean, they've got real revenue coming in. Blue Origin, sort of by contrast, still is existing mostly with the financing from Jeff Bezos. I mean, they have gotten contracts here and there, but they don't have sort of an anchor government tenant the way that SpaceX does. They have won some significant amounts of money and are bringing in more revenue and starting to sign up real customers, but not anywhere near to the extent to where SpaceX is. And SpaceX, that's why I said early on, they're the leader by far, not just because they've developed the technology, but because they've shown that you can create a business case by being a space company.
Well, Peggy asks if there will be any multinational private sector efforts, or will the Space Barons remain America-led?
No, and this is something I should pay more attention to, but you are seeing more companies sort of follow the lead of SpaceX internationally, in China and elsewhere, that they're sort of showing this could be done. And the other part of it is, yeah, we focus on, the billionaires and the rockets. That gets a lot of the attention, a lot of the hype, launching a rocket with all the smoke and the fire. That's what people come out to see. That's a sexy thing. There are a lot of other things that are going on in the space economy that are driving it. There's been a revolution in satellite technology that, satellites used to cost, hundreds of millions of dollars, be incredibly large, the size of a garbage truck, need to stay up there in space for 20, 30 years because they were so expensive. And now you're seeing, just like, the computing technology has revolutionized personal computing, and the iPhone in your pocket is far more powerful than the mainframe used 20 years ago. That's happened in satellites, and that they're small as a loaf of bread. There's a company called Planet, for example, that operates a constellation of small satellites that take an image of the Earth every day, so that you can do real Earth monitoring. And so there's a lot going on the satellite side, and that is something that you're seeing happening internationally, not just in the US. From the satellite side, where it gets tricky is who governs all of that. There's no sort of traffic cop in space, and the more satellites you put up, and we're not talking dozens, we're talking thousands of satellites that could get in each other's way. Who monitors all of that? Who's the space traffic manager? There is no one. And that's something that ultimately is going to have to be done at some sort of international body to regulate that.
Very interesting. This is somewhat related. Lorraine asks if SpaceX and other private contractors who are receiving NASA or government funding, are they accountable to the public or elected officials? And what does that accountability look like? In particular, how much money is being spent commodifying these technologies and space experiences that you're describing?
Yeah, so a lot of money is being spent at NASA has, and I can give you multiple examples of what the accountability looks like. I'll give you two. SpaceX had a mishap in 2015 where a Falcon 9 rocket that was on a mission for NASA, not carrying people, but cargo and supplies, blew up. And NASA was overseeing the investigation into that and having deep insight into SpaceX's, into their rocket, into their spacecraft, into their processes, into the hiring. For example, when Elon went on the Joe Rogan podcast, which is streaming online, and took a hit of marijuana, that upset the NASA leadership that ordered a safety investigation into SpaceX and its practices to make sure that that they had a culture that was going to ensure the safety of their practices, because ultimately they're being entrusted with the lives of NASA's astronauts. The other example I would cite is Boeing has the other commercial crew contract to fly NASA astronauts to the space station. And where SpaceX has now done it multiple times, Boeing has not been able to fly its capsule because they keep running into problems. And NASA is running in conjunction with Boeing the investigations into what's going on and why they had the first time all kinds of problems with their software, where the spacecraft thought it was at a different point in the mission entirely. It was 11 hours off, and they had to bring the spacecraft back. NASA was there helping them investigate and fix those problems, not just as an oversight, but also as a partner, because there's still a lot of expertise at NASA. Just this summer, they were ready to try to do this test launch again and realized that there was a problem with the valves. And earlier this week, actually, Boeing and NASA together held a press conference to talk about where they were in the status of that investigation. So we know a little bit more, and it gets very technical, but there are these valves in the service module of the spacecraft where the oxidizer is, and it was leaking through the seal, and combined with some moisture from the humidity in Florida that created a nitric acid, which corroded the valves and essentially made them stuck. I mean, that's a fair amount of technical detail, but we know that because this is something that's funded by taxpayers. If this was a private mission, then Blue Origin, if they're just flying on their New Shepard rocket, suborbital space tourism, they don't have to tell the public what level of detail. I would argue that it's better to inform your customers and to be transparent about what's going on. But with NASA there, they have to be accountable.
Definitely. So Judith Merowitz is asking, especially I think considering that civilians are going on some of these trips, have has there been any rethinking around space travel and its demand on the physically? Is it less physically demanding than we previously thought as a general public, or what's sort of the training? What goes into that right now?
Yeah, so the suborbital training, where if you're on, the New Shepard rocket for Blue Origin, that goes up and down. And again, it launches, reaches space, and comes back down within 10 or 11 minutes. You experience, I think it's 3.5 Gs on the way up, which is 3 times the force of gravity. And you may experience on the descent as many as 5 Gs, but for a very short amount of time. I think just a number of seconds. Blue Origin on its 2 flights, Jeff Bezos went with his brother Mark, which was intended to be a testament to the safety and the engineering of the vehicle. But he also went with Wally Funk, who is 82 years old and who was part of a program, a privately funded program, to get women who were not part of the astronaut corps in the 60s to sort of get them into the astronaut corps. And she was part of that, but was never obviously selected to be an astronaut by NASA. And so Blue Origin flew her, and she was 82 years old. When William Shatner went just this month, he's 90 years old, and was able to do it. Now, that's a suborbital trip going up and down. Going to orbit is a whole different beast. You experience heavier G loads. The other thing is, you're in space, and astronauts talk about getting sick in space. It's so disorienting. There's no up and there's no down, and your just inner ear is completely out of whack. And your mind is saying, what is going on where there's no gravity, and you're floating around, and it can be very disoriented. And a lot of people get sick. And also there's something that happens, there's a fluid shift. Whereas we're, here in gravity, and there's not all of this blood going up in our head. It flows down. But if you're upside down and that's not pulling down, it's in your head all the time, and it can, have an effect on your sinuses. And if you're there for a long time, which really at this point the tourists are just going up at most a week or 10 days, that can have real serious effects, on your eyes, on your skeleton, on your and your muscles. So yeah, that's something we continue to learn more about. But the nice thing is most people can go.
It's just amazing to think about. So Lorraine has another question. Is there concern among those documenting the privatization of space exploring technologies around the potential competing interests of companies driven by increasing private profit and researchers trying to increase access to knowledge as a public good?
Yeah, no, this is a great question, because and sort of international bodies are struggling to catch up to this. If you have a private corporation, it is not NASA. It is not operating, for the public good the way NASA is. And so they are trying to the international community to sort of come up with, what rules of the road are. So a couple of examples. Actually, Congress passed a law in 2015 that says if you are a private company and you mine on the moon, or you are able to get to an asteroid and do mining there, and there are a lot of precious metals on asteroids that could be worth a lot of money, that at least according to the United States government, that company would own those materials. But what NASA has also put together is something called the Artemis Accords, which are bilateral agreements with other nations that if they want to participate in the Artemis moon program, they have to be signatories to these accords that say, for example, if you do, science and research on the moon or a celestial body, you have to share your scientific findings, with everyone. You have to be transparent, tell people where you are, what you're doing, what the zone is, what the safety of operations are. So those are rules that I think also would govern private companies working in partnership with various governments. But I think there are a lot of questions and still a lot of work to be done, and Congress may need to intervene at some point about, what sort of regulation should be put in place to ensure that these companies are operating in a transparent way and in a way that sort of does no harm.
Yeah, and picking up on the international thread again, what do you think about, Thomas asks, what do you think about the implications of the space rivalry between China and the US, as well as the private enterprise?
So what's happening between China and the US is fascinating. China, I think, the United States sort of been to preeminent space for so long, people take it for granted. China has a very long view, doesn't have, a democratically elected government, so that you have one administration coming in and changing course or changing political parties in Congress and shifting priorities. They landed a few years ago a spacecraft, a robot on the far side of the moon, which had never been done before. Earlier this year, they landed a rover on Mars, the only other country besides the United States to do that. They are building, as I mentioned earlier, their own space station and going up there. They've announced they're going to partner with Russia on that. Russia is our partner right now on the International Space Station, but you see some shifting alliances. That's all in the sort of quote unquote civil space, but obviously what's going on with China and Russia, North Korea, and other potential adversaries has led to the creation of the Space Force, which obviously is something that President Trump took credit for, but the idea for that was long before he came into office, that people concerned about what's going on in space. And just a quick moment about that and why people in Congress have been sort of sounding the alarm on that and saying we need a Space Force is so much of the way we go to war today depends on our assets in space, our satellites in space. Satellites in space do missile defense, missile warning. They're the ones that see the missile going and tell us, hey, North Korea just fired a missile. GPS, that precision guided bomb, so that it hits, the terrorists and not the school bus. That comes from space. Secure communications, reconnaissance, all that is in space. And they're sitting ducks, those satellites. And China and Russia and others have shown that they can interfere with those satellites. They can spoof them. They can take them offline. They can blow them up with a missile. And so you're seeing a lot going on both on the civil side, but also obviously on the national security side as well.
Pivoting a little bit, Lauren is asking, well, he states, it's my understanding that solar radiation is a limiting factor for humans in long-term space travel. Is that a consideration for any of the space flights planned by these companies?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's a big deal. And particularly if you're on a long duration mission, going to Mars. I mean, that's one of the things we're going to have to figure out how to mitigate is protecting human beings against the radiation. For a short-term, suborbital space flight where you're actually in space for 3 to 4 minutes, I don't think it's that big of a deal. If you're on the International Space Station and there's a solar flare, could that be a big deal? I think probably yes. Was it a big deal for Scott Kelly, who was on the space station for almost a year? I think so. Solar radiation is it's a big deal, and it's a real concern. And one of the things we're going to have to figure out, or Jeff and Elon are going to have to figure out, if they want to build those cities on Mars.
Is there a stage where the debate about the ethics around these space travels and the new space barons is happening, specifically not just the sending the 1% into space for these sort of pleasure rides, but also the mining of other planets for resources after we've mined arguably the Earth for similar resources to sustain a certain level of human life and expectations? Where is this debate happening?
Yeah, so it should be happening at the sort of UN and these international bodies, and you are seeing some of that. I mean, one of the interesting things is, in terms of asteroids, if you're able to get there and to build the technology where you can mine asteroids and sort of use space, I don't hear a lot of dissenting view that we shouldn't be using those resources, that they're, actually, there's a story in my book where Jeff was at Princeton and he was part of a student space group and was talking about this sort of idea where you hollow out an asteroid and live in it that would protect you from radiation. And there was another student who, said, you're pillaging, the asteroids in the cosmos. And he said something like, are you really defending the rights of, barren space rocks? But there do become, what happens, for example, when China, just like the United States, is going to the moon, and they're not going to the equator of the moon, which is where we went in Apollo. They're going to the South Pole. Why? Because we now know there's water in the permanently shadowed craters of the poles of the moon. Water is enormously important for human exploration, not just because it's water to drink and sustains human life, but if you break it up, it's air to breathe. But it's also rocket fuel. Hydrogen and oxygen can be distilled to make rocket fuel that then allow you to go deeper into space, to go to Mars, to go to these asteroids. So if China's there and we're there, and you kind of see this play out, there was a series called For All Mankind that, where the United States and the Soviet Union are on the surface of the moon together and then competing. That I think that, just as we have, these international bodies at the United Nations that dictate and regulate how we interact with each other on Earth or in the skies or in the seas, there's going to be an increasing recognition that we sort of need that to happen in space.
Well, thank you so much, Christian. As we wrap up here, is there anything that our members and our audience should be looking out for from you in the future in the Washington Post or another book, or anything that we should especially tune our attention to in the news?
Well, actually, so the Post is partnering with the Discovery and Science Channel, and starting November 4th, streaming on Discovery Plus, we'll have a documentary that goes into everything that's been going on from Starship to Artemis. And if you've stayed through this whole talk, you'll feel very up to date on that show and what's happening. And just log on to WashingtonPost.com and follow my coverage and look and buy a copy of the Space Barons. But I just want to say thanks for having me. This has been a real treat, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And I'll invite Leslie to close us out.
Hi, that was fantastically interesting. Thank you so much. Wait, let me get my video back. Here we are. Well, that was just a wonderful talk, and it was so enlightening. I didn't know so much of this. So this was our first talk of the year, and we thank you for being so wonderful. Our next talk is on November 12th. It's by Clint Smith. It's about a reckoning with the history of slavery in America. We invite all of you to tune in then. So until then, thank you. And thank you so much, Chris. Bye.